any questions, and then I'd call them and answer back out. So,
Took a while.
which one was kind of interesting. That was the
Now you have to be able to do that. So this talk is going to be.
Oh, there you go.
Mobility concerns.
Just wait a couple more minutes for stragglers. Probably start at 4:02.
Yeah, I've been noticing. I follow, like, I have this like list of 200 people who follow me, and it goes like up and down. Because I don't use it enough to like actually engage, so it's like it just kind of funny.
I'm still not 100%.
Yeah, well,
I use it.
they're not doing well.
No, I know, the stock is below
Yeah,
all
they're
the other.
doing terrible. I don't think they're gonna like survive.
Basically, the consensus is that they are not.
No, I mean, there's lots of reasons too. I mean, like also like just like stuff like Snapchat came out of nowhere. Like, I was reading an article on the bus on the way over, and like Snapchat just did an update to disappearing text messages and like instant video messaging or video conferencing. Oh, so, well, you know Snapchat, right? Like you take a photo, you send it to someone, and then it disappears after like 15 seconds. So kids love it.
But there's lots of
It's genius. Yeah, exactly. But like apparently like they did this update. Apparently like, there's all these articles about like in schools where kids were just like losing their minds like using the new update. It's just, like, this stuff that comes out of nowhere, right? Like, they're not gonna use Twitter. So just look who it is. Yeah, I know Twitter after like 5 years. How's it going, Ben Wong? Kevin Batch?
Nobody can say my name.
Batch? Baggy? No, I know how to say it. Angelo? Star Wars? What's up?
Angelo from Star Wars?
Star Wars Angelo.
Is your name?
Sean is like the giver of office names.
Yeah, I give him nicknames.
I haven't heard mine yet.
He only says it when I
You don't want to hear it. No, Crispin might have the worst. I usually call him Crispin.
I can call him Crispin.
It's not a good nickname. It's the best I got. He's not at all.
I'm sure you haven't heard that.
Gotta catch my breath.
Bring the confidence back up. I'm recording.
Is there a light for the red light?
So the video says, good morning.
Okay, we'll get started, I guess. Running minutes behind. It's okay. Thank you all for coming. I gave my session a rather provocative title because I think this is how a lot of people view the topic. But I don't want to make this seem like it's a daunting kind of aggro topic or issue. So I've got a new title. Making people happy. And the reason there's a little bit of a backstory. I was at FITC earlier the week, and there's a great speaker there, and his whole thing is about happiness and what makes us happy. and it resonated with me. And whether you realize it or not, one of the issues we face with making our websites and our applications accessible, it's really about making them work for everybody. Because when they're not working for somebody, those people aren't happy. They're frustrated, they're angry, they may be sad, but regardless, we're not providing them the same experience, the experience they're expecting. So, there's another twist to this. Making people happy makes money. So, this is on the business track, so I'm going to appeal to that as well. Making people happy does make more money as a business, or replace those dollar signs with communicating your message or reaching your audience. This is really about communication, and it does make for a better world. I have a few disclaimers. Go through these quickly. First of all, I'm not certified, and I'm going to come back to that whole certification thing later. I'm not disabled at the moment, although I do wear glasses. I do need to use these to see people at the back. I probably will be disabled at some point in my life, though. And I'm sorry to say, most of you will probably be as well. And applying techniques from this presentation will hopefully result in happier people. So let's get to the point. Accessibility is not just about making websites work for blind users. That is the stereotype, that is the perception. Talk to developers, they'll say, that's just like less than 3%. But this is actually about a big segment of the population. So I've got some numbers here. People love stats. I'll let you read through this. This is from last US Census. 19.6% of the population thought of themselves as having a disability. So that's significant. A lot of people don't admit to having a disability as well. So these numbers are generally lower than reality. If you include close relatives as well, and I'm sure some of you can relate, there's an emotional connection to people who have a disability having to deal with our society, which is often skewed not in their favor. So that jumps the number up to 53%. Now I want to go back to the numbers and the dollars. We're looking at 1.3 billion people globally. That's $1 trillion in economic, like disposable income associated to these people. So ignoring that segment of the population is leaving money on the table. So for you business folks in the audience, this should resonate. And then the number at the bottom, when you consider all the other people who are attached to these have these emotional connections, we're talking about like almost $7 trillion annually. So it's a huge, huge, huge market. And again, it's not just about the money, it's also about reaching your audience, your users, your members, your community. Okay, some more numbers. Let's get a little bit more local. So in Canada, for those who are Canadian focused, 4.4 million Canadians reported a disability in 2006. I want to call out the number for those over 75 years of age and older. That jumps to 56.3, hence the inevitability that most of us, if we make it that far, will have to deal with some of these issues. But this presentation isn't just about dealing with the disabled. It's about differently able. We're not just talking about people. We're also talking about other systems, other endpoints. So I'll get into that as well. But this is a business issue. It's also a development challenge for many people who are actually in the trenches coding sites and apps. But it affects everyone at some point. So the goal is actually to make your website work everywhere. How nice an idea is that? And by everywhere, I'm talking about screen readers, right? But also voice-to-text tools, so it could be at the operating system level. Keyboard and touch UIs, those are different. You have to treat those different. Accessibility means working with different touch points, different user interfaces. Search engines and content aggregators, you may or may not be aware, they really like accessible websites because they're rich and embedded with all this metadata that help them make sense of that content. Older browsers and slower connections are also impacted. And I'll show you some stuff later, and you'll see why these are all fall into the same bucket. Same reason for feature phones and low-tech devices. And then we're going to get into APIs and other systems that are also basically looking to understand your content, understand that data. If they can make sense of it, they're going to favor it. And that goes back to the search engine stuff, right? And then, of course, there's the stuff we don't even know about yet. Future browsers and devices that may be coming out that will be, again, trying to make sense of your website. And they may not be able to today if you don't have that semantic, well-structured data with all the right metadata. Okay, now there's the business side again coming in. So why is this so relevant right now? How many people here know what AODA is? Familiar with it? Oh, good. That's excellent. How many of you had to deal with AODA? Okay, great. So I can kind of skip over this. You know this date, January 1, that came, right? By January 21, that's the next deadline. I personally would like to see things move a little bit quicker than this. I think if you're going to wait until 2021, you're really missing out based on my earlier slides. But there's also the financial incentive for those who are still on the fence. You can be penalized as an organization big time. Just so this is clear, there is no accessibility or AODA police. There is no, actually, at this point in time, there is no governing body going around doing audits, but that may happen. The way the provincial government is treating it right now, it's kind of like filing your taxes. No one's going to come after you if you don't file your taxes, but you could be audited in the future, and you could be reported on as well. So if somebody does report you as not being accessible, then steps can be taken. And if you do not react and remedy those situations, then you can get into this territory. We can talk about that. But worse yet, you're going to have unhappy people. Your sites are not accessible. Okay, the next slide is actually going back to a little bit more money because the cost, this often comes up when we're talking to clients about building a website and incorporating accessibility, and they want to know how much is it going to cost? How much more is this going to cost to make my website accessible? As if it's an add-on, a checkbox, and we have to estimate for it and make it a line item on the invoice. These numbers are just because people like numbers, but it really could be anything. It might not cost you much at all. It might cost a few hours. Or if you're retrofitting a really big site, it could cost weeks or months. And depending on your billing rate, yeah, that could cost a lot for your client. But they have to balance that with the potential, the cost of either being fined or the lost revenue, the lost opportunities, the bad will in the marketplace, like the tarnishing of their brand image is going to take. And that's where it gets kind of intangible, because on the one hand, that marketing director wants to know how much is this going to cost because it affects their budget. But how much are they going to lose if some people can't access their site, can't buy their products, and then they bitch about that to their family, and then their family bitches about that to their friends, and then they, who knows how much. I mean, the damage can be very irreversible at that point too. Something people like to ask about is this, so certification versus conformance. So I said earlier, I'm not certified, there is no certification. You can take these courses to become a certified accessibility expert. I have two thoughts on all this. One is that certification is bullshit, okay? Because there is no defined set of rules of how you can make your product accessible. It's going to depend on the content, on the application, on the use cases. The other reason is because conformance, and this is actually, when you talk about AODA, you have to conform to WCAG 2.0, level A. This is for most businesses. So conformance means if you go through the whole list of what all the guidelines are, they're guidelines, first of all, not rules, guidelines. And there are recommended ways to handle all these different situations. But sometimes, if you just go by the letter, you might not be making your product or your website more accessible. Sometimes you could be making it worse. It really depends. And we're going to get into some of these depends kind of situations in a minute. So for those of you who are developers, I'm going to get a little bit technical later. And for those of you who are more business-minded, I am going to get a little bit technical later, so I won't be offended if you like the ladies over and walk out this morning. But the real thing I want you to leave with today is the notion that while you may not be able to do everything up front, the important thing is that you're responsive to people's needs. And when things come up, because this is not a one pass and you're done. All right, we're accessible, good, move on. No, you're probably going to have to come back to it again and again. Especially if you are working with a client who's evolving their product over time. I mean, websites don't just like live in one state, they're often added onto, more content gets added, new sections are added, so it's an evolving thing. These are some kind of guidelines I would give you, or some suggestions for how you can kind of have the right attitude with dealing with this. You know, be considerate with your content and your design choices. Some people are just oblivious. They need to be educated as to why things should be coded a certain way, or why content should be written a certain way, why a link, like a hyperlink, should be worded a certain way. Validate your code. I mean, some of this stuff is just basic stuff. If you're not doing this as a developer, we need to talk. Provide alternatives whenever possible, because that will, let me give you some light back there. That is often the best route to accessibility. Sometimes some things cannot be made accessible for all users. Accept that. Provide an alternative. Right? And when, like an example, so you've got a podcast. It's audio. For your deaf users, you provide a text transcript. That's just a very simple example. Fix things as soon as you can. You will have validation issues. I bet you everybody here, if you go and check your websites, you're going to have issues. Address them. But understand that there will probably be more around the corner, and you're going to, potentially be contacted by someone saying, this isn't accessible. It could be your QA tester, or it could be your customer. So be responsive, fix things when you can. And another key thing is to put a page on your website with contact info, so that people who are having trouble with your service or your site can contact you and let you know about it, because you might not realize. Again, this goes back to the validation thing. You can validate your entire website. Yay, no errors. Woohoo, I'm accessible. Maybe not. Somebody else might be able to show you where you're not accessible in some way, because there are many different ways someone might be differently able. A good idea is to actually plan on it at the beginning. So when you're starting out a project, if you have accessibility in mind, it will make your life a lot easier than if you're trying to retrofit after. You're at the end, the week before the launch, and the client says, "Oh, and we're going to be AODA compliant, right?" And you're like, "Uh-huh, fuck." Got a lot of work to do. But if you plan it and you implement the proper techniques early on, it's a lot easier. It takes a lot less time. You have a lot less rework, a lot less refactoring. Have some tools and checklists in place. I will provide you with a listing of tools in a little bit. Factor in the extra time, because it's just like, we had a chat about estimation yesterday, and everybody underestimates. And if you're not even thinking about this, you are going to be short for time, because it does take a little extra. Not just on the development side, but with the content development. So working with your client and the content team. Working with your designers as well. We were working on a big project last summer, and we had to be AODA compliant well in advance. They even wanted to be double A. WCAG 2.0 AA, which brings in an extra level of conformance requirements, including color contrast. And so the design team, which had come up with a beautiful palette of colors for the site, was a little bit mortified when I told them that, that a couple of those colors actually failed in terms of color contrast requirements. So they had to go back and come up with some colors that worked. And that was, again, more time, more effort, more reworking, more repacking. But at least we caught it before the site went live. Okay, so a couple ways to approach things. First of all, like I said, design. Start at the beginning. So when you're designing and you're developing, you're testing, those are like the three main kind of parts of building a website. There's also content in there, in the design and the development. Some tips. Pick your color palette and establish your font sizing early on, especially if you are AA, if you have to meet the AA requirements. That affects governments, I think educational institutions as well. And we should all be going for AA, so if you can, do it. Use code validators throughout development, like you said, not just at the end. Really helps if you catch these things early on. And watch out for regressions. Henrik's going to do a great talk later on behavior-driven development and automating tests, because that really helps. Because sometimes a change later, you can test and validate and make sure you're okay at one point in the project, but you know, more coding is done, more changes are made, and then something might now not be accessible. So you have to watch out for that. But there's two parts to this. It's not just the code, it's also the content. So content, accessible content and accessible code is where you get the happy people. So, how many people in here work with content development? Anybody? Okay, so we have a few content developers. Okay, great. Designers in the room? Hands? Okay. Not too many developers. Mostly. Any people here, pure business? Managers? Okay. Okay, good. So some approaches to take, use a multi-pronged approach, and by that, I'm talking about not just using code validators, but also, if you can, find some people who are differently able to test your products, to test your sites, because they will reveal things that no code validator will. And don't just rely on one person in your organization to find everything. Because like I said, there are a lot of little nooks and crannies where these accessibility issues can crop up. Do multiple passes, and like I said, more eyes and ears the better. The more people looking at your site and testing it, the better, because everyone will catch different things. Okay, now's when I'm going to get technical. So for those of you who aren't up for it, it's not going to be super technical, but I'll understand if you glaze a bit. For the developers, specify the language of the page, and if there is a segment in that page that's in a different language, you should be calling that out as well. Does that, I see some furrow brows. You know what I mean by that? Okay. If anybody doesn't, just like holler, raise your hands
No.
at any point. No what? You don't understand?
No.
Okay, so you maybe have an HTML page which is in English. You may have, and in the top of your source code, in your DOM, it's going to indicate your HTML language equals English.
It's a meta.
It's metadata.
Oh.
But that metadata can also be applied within the content, within a paragraph. There may be, you might use a French expression. Well, for screen readers, if they read that French expression thinking it's English, it's going to sound pretty funny. You can actually specify that that little string of text within that paragraph is actually in French, and a screen reader will recognize that and change the way it pronounces the words. Magic. Use lists for menus and buttons for buttons. This is for the front end guys. If you are creating a menu, you should use an unordered list. Don't just use a bunch of divs, okay? Because this helps group the content in a semantic way so that our screen reader or some of these other devices will recognize, oh, this is a listing of navigational items. Similarly for a button, don't just use a div or a span and style it up in CSS to make it look like a button. Call it out, use the button tag. This is HTML5 stuff for those of you who aren't aware. You can do this. And it makes a difference. Because again, this is a semantic data. It's going to call out and mean different things in different machines and different readers and different applications. Number your headings correctly. Who knows what that, who doesn't know what I mean when I say number your headings correctly? I'm talking about H1s, H2s, H3s. A lot of people, I'm not going to name names because I've probably done it too, will use an H3 to make a title look smaller on the page. And that H3 comes after an H1 that which was the title for the entire page. But that H3 is actually like a Twitter link, has nothing to do with the H1. Your H's actually get nested, and I'm going to show you some tools you can use to identify if you tag your headings properly and accordingly. But they're not to be used for styling. Use spans for that. Use classes to style your text. And use the appropriate elements and attributes. So, Alex, this is more metadata. If you're using an abbreviation, you use the abbreviation tag. So for like a language toggle, if you had a short form FR to change the language of the page to French, you should wrap that FR in an abbreviation tag. Okay. So that, well, for one thing, a tooltip like will pop up if you scroll your mouse over it. It'll actually say French. Okay. Alt, that's for images. You don't always have to fill in the alt tag. In fact, sometimes you should not fill in the alt tag if it's a decorative element. But if it adds contextual meaning to the page, or it has it's conveying information which is supplementing the text on that page, there better be an alt tag, because that's important information you're supposed to be relaying. That's your content. But if it's really just an image that is adding a little bit of flair to your page and actually contains no valuable information whatsoever, please leave it empty. Again, titles, this is important for things like sometimes for form elements, sometimes for iframes, and lang we talked about, so that's language. And again, for video and audio, upload your captions and your transcripts. If you're using YouTube, it's great. It'll automatically generate captions for a lot of video, but only if it's really clear. Like they can pull out some of that, but it might not capture all of it. You can actually go in and edit that in YouTube. So edit, I've got at the end of the presentation, a whole slide with some links for that stuff. Okay, so some more stuff, more technical stuff. Who's familiar with ARIA? A-R-I-A. 1, 2, 3, 4. Okay, not many. Okay, W-A-I. That's an abbreviation for the Web Accessibility Initiative. ARIA is Accessible Rich Internet Applications. Basically allows you to handle JavaScript states and when you have pop-ups and drop-downs and modals and stuff like that. So specify those states. Again, I'll have lots of links for ARIA stuff, so you can dig into that later. Use text indent instead of display none for icons. So if you're using icons, graphical images to display, I don't know, Twitter buttons or whatever, don't just leave an empty anchor tag and have JavaScript or fill in the blanks, whatever. Just include the text in the anchor. Just move it off the screen. That way, when somebody's looking at your page without any style, without any images, could be a search engine, could be a screen reader, it will read the content of that anchor link and make sense to people. Oh, that goes somewhere. And specify tab order on complex forms, or if you can, make your forms simpler. This is basic advice. We can get into deep dive on any of these things, but in the context of our time today, we're going to just kind of leave it at that. So what about widgets? So this is where the ARIA comes into play. It enables dynamic JavaScript-driven applications and widgets to interoperate with a variety of desktop-based assistive technologies. This is kind of some magic fairy dust you can sprinkle on your JavaScript after the fact or while you're coding it. Some packages will actually include the appropriate area elements within your code. If you're using like jQuery libraries, jQuery is actually pretty good these days. It just provides additional semantic information so that a screen reader will know that the focus has shifted from one part of the page to another, that a new window has popped up and their attention should now be taken to that. So it applies to menus, sliders, trees, meaning like nested folders and so on, and dialog boxes. Does this using you can use landmarks, regions, and grids. So there's a whole. I mean we could do a whole day workshop just on that. We're not going to. Here's a really basic example instead. So this is for a toolbar. So say we're going to build a little custom WYSIWYG editor and we want to have a cut, a copy, and a paste button in our toolbar, in a row. First of all, we assign the div a role of toolbar. So that's clear. We give it a tab index 0. And you see that area active descendant equals button 1. That's just calling out what the first one is in the list. And then you've got your role button for each of these images. It should have been buttons, but you can do it this way if you want. Real simple. Does that make sense?
Does that mean that the button 1 is in an active state?
That's the active descendant. No, it's not in the active state, but it's the descendant of
Child.
The child.
Like the first child.
Yeah, exactly.
You could do an on change to change that value to button 2 if it was selected, and it would provide the appropriate context.
Exactly. All right, let's look at some common pitfalls. All right, these are real world examples. These have all cropped up in projects I've worked on. So I'm sure some of them will resonate with you guys as well. Keyboard traps. Do you know who doesn't know what a keyboard trap is?
I know.
Okay, a keyboard trap is what happens when somebody is using keyboard only to navigate through a page and they get stuck somewhere on the page. This can happen, in a recent example, it happened when there was a widget that opened, that would open like a little iframe if you tabbed over to one of the links and you couldn't get out of that iframe. You're stuck. So we had to fix that. Do a step on that one, actually. Invisible focus. So again, this is for keyboard users. When you're tabbing through the links in the page, it should be very clear which anchor the focus is on. By default, most browsers will just have a little dotted outline. Some UI designers and front-end coders in the past would disable that because they didn't like the way it looked. But that's really bad practice because some people rely on that to figure out where the hell they are on the page when they're tabbing through. Empty anchors. So again, this is going back to if you're using like a little icon in an anchor instead of using a word. It's common to just use CSS to inject a little background image to display your pretty icon. But if your anchor tag is empty, that anchor is nothing. It doesn't mean anything to a screen reader. Headers, again, used for styling, instead use classes. So like I can harp on that all day. Insufficient contrast, so just a little bit of trivia there. This really only affects men, but it really affects some men. And gray on gray is like a deadly combination. And also a lot of issues around oranges and yellows. And it just, if you design with this in mind early on, You won't have the problems. And I'll show you some tools for how you can actually determine what your color contrast is, and if you are conforming or not. Just a bit. And this is one where you might have to push back on your client a little bit, because they've just paid a lot of money for some CEO expert to come in and tell them how they can improve their search engine ranking by stuffing all the alt tags on their page, on the images in their page. But that's a really shady practice. The alt tag should only be used to describe the contents of the image, not to push a marketing initiative through. Now this is a Drupal camp, so I've got a little token Drupal slide here. This is the official statement by Drupal.org on accessibility and how important it is. Drupal 7 is actually pretty good. Out of the box, it has a lot of the best practices baked into it. If you don't fuck them up with your own custom theming layers, you should be okay. And custom modules, that's where you start to get into trouble. But a lot of modules, a lot of the core modules and contrib modules that we use on a day-to-day basis have already got a lot of the plumbing in place. There's actually a hashtag, it's hashtag DAX for accessibility. You'll see that on Drupal.org for some of the modules, and also some of the themes. So like Zen and adaptive themes are both committed to being accessible. So they have a lot of really cool semantic data already built into them. But again, if you're going to roll your own, you have to do a little bit more work.
Do you have an idea how someone with a disability can use Drupal for managing the content?
That's a whole other session. And there is actually, like the WCAG is for the front end for the content, there is actually an ACAG for authoring content. And that initiative is a few years behind. But it is a big issue, especially in Ontario. I'm just waiting to see when the kind of the reveal. But it will become an issue at the legal stage, because we have laws in Ontario and in Canada for fair and equal access in the company. So for somebody to be able to do their job, if that means going onto the website, signing in, and adding content, that has to be accessible too, regardless of AODA. This is outside of AODA. Okay, so for those of you who've been patiently waiting for the resources, we're going to get into that. I've broken this down into three kind of main buckets. So I'm going to share with you today some tools. I'm going to list some websites and provide you with some books and a few other things. There are a number of toolbars and plugins for code validating. These are the ones that I've tried and tested. I've bolded the ones that I like the best and I've had the best luck with. And I've also provided a little bit of a guide as in terms of browser support. You'll see the only one that works in all three browsers is the last one I've listed here. And not that those are the only three browsers, the three main ones. It's the HTML code sniffer, and that's because it's a bookmarklet that you can just drag to your bookmarks toolbar and it will work on any browser, even Opera. This is the Wave toolbar. This is what it looks like. I've just put arrows to the two features on it that I use most often. Text only and outline. So text only basically just strips out all the images, strips out all the CSS, and you can actually read your page as a screen reader would read it. It's very enlightening. Look at your page from top to bottom in text only, and hopefully it makes sense, because sometimes it doesn't. A lot of people use CSS to, like just change the layout and move things around, and that doesn't necessarily put things in a good order. So this is a great way of checking basically your document object, or your DOM, in terms of how you've structured the content on the page. And the outline mode will show you your H's and how they've been nested, and will call out if you've got any errors there. And I provided the link, so you can look at that. Only works in Firefox, unfortunately, but it works well. So this is the HTML code sniffer. That's what it looks like. There's a link. Go to the website. Just drag this orange banner to your bookmarks toolbar, and there you go. I got a few screenshots just so you can see what it looks like in action. So it'll just, you just go to a page, click on your little bookmarklet up there, and it'll pop up that little widget on the right. As you can see, Google's got a few issues. That's for single A. But the important thing I have to also stress is that if you're using a code validator, do not just rely on that code validator to tell you what's right and what's wrong. You have to actually go in and look at every single error and warning and validate at a human level whether it is actually an issue or not. Sometimes there will be like what I call false positives. It'll flag something as being an error, but when you go and look at it, it's like, no, what? That's fine. It's okay. It's still accessible. So you do have to apply some common sense. But it's kind of cool. It'll give you like this little report, and you can just kind of scroll through, and it'll even like call out with like that little yellow little pin where on the page the issue is. We'll give you a little bit of a code snippet at the bottom that it's flagged as being problematic. And the nicest thing about this is it'll actually call out which principle is being impacted here in the WCAG 2.0 set guidelines, and which technique you can use to fix it. So it's really handy. For color contrast, this is my go-to tool. It's the WebAIM color contrast checker. You'll have to use potentially, depending on how your site's going, you might have to actually take a screenshot and open it up in something like Photoshop to get the color values. You just drop in your foreground color and your background color, and it'll tell you what your contrast ratio is. And depending on, you can actually specify if you're looking for if it's AA or AAA, because there are increasing levels of contrast required. And I'll also just call it that it's got the normal text versus large text. So you might fail for normal text with a certain color combo, but be just fine for large text. So that's another thing just to watch for. Again, this we worked in a project a few months ago, and this was crucial to determine the right colors at the design phase, as we were actually working on the initial concepts and mock-ups, so that we can make sure that 2 months later we weren't going to be having to re-color code everything, because that like a little shift in color can really get a designer's like freaked out. So you want to try and if they understand that that's basically a design constraint that they need to work with. It's all cool, right? You just work within the constraints. That's a design challenge. You make it fun. Okay, so here's some go-to websites. You don't have to take pictures of everything, but you can. These will all be posted. WCAG 2.0, that's the official spec. If you want to fall asleep, read that. Understanding conformance, however, is a much more engaging read, because it tries to put into normal language what you need to do to actually meet the guidelines goals. So I probably spend way more time here than there. WebAIM is a great resource. They've got lots of checklists. They've got like a color contrast checker I showed you. They've actually developed a wave toolbar. Awesome folks, and they just give it all away. Yeah, this WebAIM, Web Accessibility for Designers, it's a nice little infographic. The infographic is not accessible, but they provided a listing of everything in that infographic right below, so the page is accessible. So that's how it's a nice example of how you can handle certain challenges, right? Because infographics are notoriously bad, especially when they're wrapped in a single flat JPEG or PNG. Your alt tag would be enormous to try and cover it that way. Just provide an alternative. So on the area resources, so this is again more for the developers. They're the ones who are going to have to try and make sense of it all. But the nice thing is that there's actually there's basically an answer for every problem. If they just list it all, like for every single type of scenario, there's a workaround, a way to handle it. There's also an official guide and some design patterns with examples. So this is what I was showing you. They'll actually get into various ways of dealing with pop-ups, different form elements, lists, and stuff like that. Obviously, in the context of a 45-minute presentation, I can't cover everything, so I encourage you to read some books if you're more interested in this topic. This just came out this year. It's the latest one I just picked up this week. I haven't gotten all the way through it yet, but it's very well structured, reads very well. It's called A Web for Everyone. which is kind of the heart of my message as well. And again, a little bit older. I took a few off that I had on last year to try and focus this. This is really for developers. This stuff is really helpful. Universal design, that's another kind of tagline that you'll see in the accessibility world, also known as inclusive design. But that includes everything from like architecture and wayfinding and all sorts of stuff. But still, a lot of that still applies. Okay, so captions and transcripts for those who have to deal with audio and video. Like I said, YouTube has a lot of great tools. They have a lot of great reference material that you can use and to learn how to prepare your transcripts and your caption files. And they've even got like officially sanctioned captioning services. So if you just want to tell your client where they can go to get their video and audio transcribed, there are a number of companies out there that just do that as a service. All right, I want to talk a little bit about community, following on the heels of Mark's sermon's little talk today, which I thought was a wonderful keynote, and it really does capture how important community is to what we do, what we're all here for, and what we're building and where we're going. And we're in a really great part of the world for this, because we actually, in Toronto alone, we have camps and conferences. There are several within easy driving distances. We have meetups every month. There are LinkedIn groups, and tons of people on Twitter that I encourage you all to follow. So these are the camps and conferences. Accessibility Camp Toronto happens every year in the fall, the last few years anyways. The local meetup group organizes it, great bunch of folks. Our company therefore sponsored it last year, and we learned a ton just being at that conference. The Accessibility Conference coming up, this is in Guelph, so that's you Guelph hosts that one, coming up in May. And then we have in Ottawa, the International Summit on Accessibility coming up in July. So if you are able to, I highly encourage going to these things. They are eye-opening. I see most of the people in the room here are well-abled, but your eyes and mind will definitely be opened by seeing what other people are dealing with. They can share a lot of valuable information that will probably change your mind about some of the stuff. So I mentioned groups. In Toronto, we have the Toronto Accessibility Inclusive Design Group. Great bunch of guys. They just had a meetup last week on Wednesday, which I couldn't make, but I wish I could. Actually, yeah, it was this past week on Wednesday. And there's a LinkedIn Web Accessibility Group. You have to apply. They'll accept you. They're a pretty open bunch. And then I also want to encourage you guys to follow these twits. The top row, so Mike Gifford, he's big in the Drupal community. He works a ton on accessibility and making Drupal better. He's one of my heroes. And the next three are those are the three guys who run the Toronto Accessibility Inclusive Meetup group. Jennison used to, he just recently moved to San Francisco. He got a job with LinkedIn actually. Carl Groves is a great guy. He came to Accessibility Camp and spoke. He works with Mike Paciello group. They're big advocates. David Lepofsky on the right. He's a lawyer. He's a serious shit disturber. He's basically bugs the provincial government every day to get their game on, because they've made all these commitments. They promised to put all these things in place, and every single day he calls them out. It's been 397 days since the government said they were going to do this, and they haven't done it yet. But he's also really cool. And if you ever do get to meet him, he's very Marco English. So the guys, Marco English, he's actually the accessibility guy for Mozilla. So he's the one basically championing accessibility efforts in our favorite browser. Global Awareness Day is worth following. That's coming up soon. The Ontario government does have its own Twitter account where they try and let you know what's going on in that sphere. And then the IAAA, which is the International Association of Accessible Professionals, they also have a Twitter account. So this is just like a handful of Twitter people you can follow. They are really, really passionate bunch, and they're always posting links to new tools, new techniques, new issues, new challenges. So I highly encourage you to follow them all if you're on Twitter. That kind of wraps it up. I want to thank you all for caring. Questions? I think we got some time. Oh, yeah. Yes.
There's a couple things that I wanted to comment on. So I was curious about the IE8 usage that we have right now on the web, and then how that correlates. And I don't expect you to have an answer to this. And that how that correlates to the amount of people that may have accessibility issues in accessing content on a site. So from a business perspective, when a client says, you know, how much more is it going to cost to have, let's say, a AA accessible site, conversation should, and assuming they also want to have support for IE8, maybe we should look at the numbers, right? So if IE8 is, you know, 3%, and accessibility is somewhere in the 4 or 5%, like dollar-wise, or even if accessibility is in the 2%, but accessibility is much more inexpensive to apply to the site from the beginning, because really accessibility, in my eyes, is programming properly and professionally versus hacking it, right? Maybe it should be a conversation like that. So it's really just, it's not a question that I have, it's more of a comment, right? Yeah. I want to throw out there.
I like that.
Well,
Good point.
philosophically, if you look at IE8 and you look at the differently abled community at large, one is going to be going away.
Yeah, yeah.
The other is not. Put your money in the accessibility bucket.
I will use that next time.
Not a big fan of IE8. There are other browsers. We can recommend. Any other questions?
Do you know if, oh, sorry. Do you know if Drupal 8 is implementing kind of area attributes, stuff like that?
Drupal 8 is doing a bunch of stuff. So I don't know if I have it up.
Currently, it claims to be the most accessible open source CMS.
Yeah, let me just move this away to this screen.
What
And
actually
take this up. This is the, oops, there we go. The screen sharing is acting funny. Back in there.
Are you live tweeting this?
There's kind of the answer to your question, Rowan. So there's actually, there are a number of initiatives. There's Area HTML5, HTM5. Yeah, we're trying to do as much as possible before it launches, obviously. And like there's Mike's smiling face at the top right, like he's big into this. Philip, you had a question?
Yeah, so I used to be very familiar with all the WCAG stuff, but I'm less familiar now, and I'm not on top of all of the technology anymore. But I did start to work with HTML5 and headings, and to be honest, I've become confused now. So with the way heading structures work in HTML5, are you actually now encouraged to have H1s within different regions? Or like a hierarchy of H's within each region?
Yes.
And then so you can have multiple H1s as long as there's only, as long as the hierarchy is correct, kind of.
Well, think about like a single
structurally,
page
and then
site.
within each region.
Like if you're doing a single page site where, like technically on the page, I mean, you click through your navigation to jump to major sections. That's like in place of you structuring your thing out as, your website out as separate pages. But you're still technically presenting separate documents. But the idea is to use the heading structure to present the structure of like a single document from like start to finish. You start with a new H1, that's a new document. The same way you do like, you know, chapter headings or, you know, structuring a book. Right?
But
So
the nesting is the key.
Yeah.
So as long as you can have one H1 for the page, and then you can have a series of articles within that page. And each article can have its own H1 as well. The key though is that your nesting within each article is still cool. Right? Your H1s come before your H2s and then your H3s. You don't go skip from H2 to H4. Yeah, but that is an issue because some code validators will spit out an error if you have more than one H1. In HTML5, that's perfectly okay as long as the nesting makes sense. And that's why like that little toolbar I was showing you is so helpful. And just seeing at a high level, is there a logical order and flow to the way I've nested them? Because as you go up in number, you are getting more granular on the same topic.
You think about it as doing like an unordered list where you have nested unordered lists. It does the same thing, right? Like it's just kind of creating an invisible structure more so than like if you're, actually putting it in a giant nested list.
Yes.
Because some content creators like to go nuts sometimes, would you recommend hiding or somehow disabling the full HTML filter for content creators? Because we told a client once, oh, you were using full HTML all over the place. Can you not do that? Like, no.
Yeah, that's a tough one because you have to, if you're going to take away that flexibility from them, you have to build in potentially more granular field level opportunities to accommodate those needs. So if you know what I mean? Like if they want to be able to do all kinds of rich text editing, that is going to generally muck up the data. And it's not going to be clean. So if you account for that when you're developing and you're designing your system, hopefully you can mitigate that. But it's really, I don't know, it's going to depend on your use case, I guess.
I usually like to start like ridiculously narrow and then wait for them to ask for things, specific things. Like I mean, and the problem with I think like if it relates back to like the heading, like when you give them access to the headings and they don't know how to properly structure that content, that's dangerous, right? Right. So if you do that though, right, maybe you provide different styles, there's different ways you can do it, but it's good to like understand the problem that they're having that requires them to get into the HTML versus just saying, okay, fine, like I don't want to argue with you about this, like I'll just give you everything, like try to solve the problem. If they want to be able to put in an image or a YouTube video, well, there's plugins for every what you see, what you get editor to do both those things. So maybe the plugin's a better solution, but you have to like look at the issue they're actually looking to get that access for and try to solve that instead of just being like, well, I'll just activate every single little button, and then it's just ugly and confusing for people who have lesser skill set.
One of the things to keep in mind with accessibility for sites is it's not a one-time thing. So when you build a site that's accessible and you deliver it or you launch it for the first time, that site will change. So content editors will go in there and start adding content, and if you give them enough power, they'll start adding tables, they won't add their alt tags, and then this site becomes inaccessible eventually. So whatever you can do to prevent or to mitigate that kind of a problem is a good thing. And limiting the WYSIWYG is a big part of that.
Yeah, WYSIWYGs are evil.
Well, just ask Karen McGrath.
WYSIWYGs are evil if your client wants to be able to do like, I want 2-column layouts on my WYSIWYG. Like, no.
Yeah, exactly.
Here are your areas.
Yeah.
She also
Bold, italic, here's some headers. That's what we do. We lock it down. We say, you really want to edit this?
Yeah.
That's great.
Yeah.
But
Yeah. And there's other ways you can architect a smarter solution, really. Like if they want to be able to do layout stuff,
yeah,
there's cool ways to do that.
it's way up front.
Yeah,
You have
that's
to be really clear with them. Like we're going to give you the tools to edit the content, especially in all these different areas. But we're not going to give you so much control. Because we get like, oh, we want to build like a whole microsite. We want to build a landing page, and we want the layout to change. And we want it totally different. Like okay, let's build it as a separate site.
Yeah.
That's what it is. It's just a communication between your client.
once.
Yeah, that's where you start. I mean, as a freelancer, you sort of pick your jobs, but if you just kind of mold your client to be the client you want, and especially way up front, if you outline it initially, then you later on down the road you don't have those conflicts of like, well, we want to do this, like, what we want to help you get to that point. But
Yeah.
Let's get you there.
Well, clients just want like intelligent justification for why you would take a stance on something, right? Like just saying no because you're too dumb to use the what you see is what you get editor is the wrong way to go about it, but explaining your strategy for like inhibiting those things, and then other potential solutions which are dynamic, and I mean there's any number of ways that you can treat that solution. I mean there's fieldable entities, there's
Like generally our
panels.
spin is we'll give you a
What's this,
template, you can drop in, we'll add something,
Almost ready?
Mhm.
extensions to the video.
Oh, yeah, those
you
spots
drop
are a little
something in without
Um,
giving them the ability
As soon as
to
you're
drop.
done, you can
I
send
mean,
it
you can give
over.
them iframe
That's cool.
and
Thanks.
PHP,
Yeah.
but
Just don't want
they're gonna have to pay you later on to fix
Fix
it,
it,
so
yeah.
don't.
let people break
It's just
stuff,
it's a
right?
communication problem.
Anyways, this was just meant to be a kind of an introduction, so I hope you got some out of it, some value out of it. If you want to contact me about this offline or after the fact, there's my contact info. And I try to keep the corporate angle to a minimum, but I do have a our company does try to build the best accessible websites. Give us a call.
Yeah.